podcast number 2. So thank you for joining me, Launders. I think you're one of the perfect people to talk about analysis with. So I'm really excited for this one. So thanks for taking part.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I can't think of anyone I'd rather talk about analysis with. So let's get it.
Oh my God. I'm blushing. Well, let's get right into it then. But first of all, I think it's really relevant for people that aren't familiar with you to sort of understand some of your backstory here, because I think, for me too, there's definitely spots with your backstory that I'm sure that I'm aware about when it comes to becoming the kind of person or the kind of thinker that sort of found a lot of joy and passion towards the idea of analysis. And it's such a big process. So where did you get started with being like an analytical thinker even? And how did that apply to the games? Was there a particular moment, or, what inspired you? And what's the backstory really for you as an analyst?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I wouldn't say that I was ever very good at math or would think about things actively from an analytical perspective when I was growing up, but I found that I had a knack for teaching people. So I just found that I could explain things a little bit more easily and get someone to do something that was hard to understand. And I think that drove me to become more analytical. So when I started playing CSGO, for example, I would help people through these KZ maps over and over again, and I would just teach them how to airstrafe, and then how to bunny hop, and then how to do this jump and follow them. And then every day I would come into the server and there'd be somebody new that didn't know how to do the maps. And then I thought, hey, why don't I just make a video so that I can just refer them to the video, and then they can learn themselves. And then, everyone could see that video and it'd be a lot easier. And then that's how I became like the B-hop guy or the movement guy. And I found that I had I found it came easy to me to explain to people how to do these kind of strange things, like understanding air acceleration in CSGO. It's kind of a weird topic to talk about. It's almost like explaining audio to somebody who doesn't understand what audio is, because you can't see it. You have to kind of use analogies and remember what it's like to be learning yourself, which I think some people lack that ability. And I found that it was quite easy for me. So that's how I got into kind of analysis, was actually just with movement and explaining mechanics in CSGO.
It's really interesting that, you describe it as, stuff that you can't see. And I think that's where there is a lot of confusion, and where you really need to begin to sort of understand like what analytical thinking is. It comes from having a methodology and being able to create a model, because you get data all the time. And so how did you start that process? Because for me, it took a pretty long time of trial and error and study and trying to deconstruct things and sort of, backwards engineer, certain plays or this, that, or the other, to like understand what the data was telling me, or understand like what good models were to interpret what was going on.
Learning purely from the outside has always been very difficult for me. So playing on a team was a big way to kind of conquer that hurdle of trying to understand what it's like without actually experiencing it myself. So I was able to answer like a lot of those questions for myself by actually playing on a team and interacting with people, and then seeing what worked and what didn't. And I feel like a lot of the big lessons I learned came from understanding that, that you can have something be ideal on paper, but then in game, it's just not realistic. And that's really important to realize, and coming out with measured analysis based on that. Because I think that one of the shortcomings of a lot of analysts are just seeing things in an almost black and white perspective, and praising playing Counter-Strike like chess, when in reality it's impossible to play the game like it's chess.
Yes, that was always for me a very frustrating analogy that people would draw, or sort of comparison, because because as you're saying here, and as we're sort of talking about sort of the intangible nature, like how hard it is to sort of quantify certain things that's happening in the game and sort of translate that into, oh, then this is good or this is bad, is, it's because there are unknowns. There's a risk. There's a lot of risk that you're weighing up. You can't accurately quantify everything. So you have to instead create like certain ways of discerning what is sort of good enough. And it's like in poker, that you have a strong hand, pre-flop, and but then things change when the flop comes down, and there's this constantly like changing percentages insofar as like what you're doing. So then it becomes ridiculous, anyone who has played poker, to, for example, take the approach, as you say, which some people do, and well, most people would, which is becoming outcome oriented, as saying, okay, well, I can't understand what's going on here, so what must be the truth is the outcome, which of course we know that is lazy analysis and not accurate analysis. So like, did you have a moment when you felt like, hang on, because I definitely was outcome oriented to begin with, before I really started to value analytical thought and really tried to push myself in harder directions to really seek the truer answers, born from my frustration as well. That the whole motivation for me was out of frustration, because I really wanted to win, and I was not like dissatisfied with sort of my lack of understanding, and sort of these I felt like I would always hit these walls, and I could never really understand why it was, and that sort of motivated me to sort of seek out something that wasn't the outcome as the answer.
So you said you hit these walls. Did you hit them did you hit them trying to become an IGL, or trying to make calls, or on an individual level?
On an individual level initially, as a jeweler, I was hitting walls where I would struggle to really find improvement from the playtime. Like, it seemed like I was making mistakes over and over again. But the thing is that the mistakes were happening because I didn't know that they were mistakes yet, and because I didn't have a good model or a way to think about the game, or any sort of analytical thought at all, to be honest. It made it impossible for me to understand like why this was even a mistake. And so that's when I was sort of drawn to the outcome. But then eventually I realized that it doesn't make sense. There's something was missing there. And then that sort of pushed me further. And it was actually later on when I started to get into poker and StarCraft and fighting games, and just learning as much as I could about everything, and Quake World in particular, then when I really started to understand how to create models, and then how to sort of put the data of the game in through a model and be like, okay, this model is good or this model is bad, and start to find there's a thread that runs through all these games from an analytical perspective. Like let's say like Fortnite. Fortnite, building is a really big deal. It's known by another name, positioning. That's what is happening. It is just getting superior positioning and outplaying someone with positioning. That is something that's incredibly crucial in Quake World, in Street Fighter, in StarCraft, games of completely different genres. Yet there is this common thread that runs through all of these things, and positioning is one of those concepts. So once you start, I think that really helped me going from game to game, because I really started to see and learn different ideas, because that were very, very critical. Like, if you are a Fortnite player, that is at the top of your list. You're like, this is super important. Like, I know that positioning is super, super important. Whereas in Quake, it's very important, but other stuff is important too. So each game or genre can serve to, for me, emphasize certain elements that are important to think about when you're building these models.
So on the spectrum of esports titles, you have MOBAs and RTSs that move a little bit more slowly, and it's easier to play methodically, and you could probably make room for 2 to 3 analysts on a team, and all the preparation you do could result in, a much more like guaranteed, you could guarantee a much better performance out of your team just without even practicing against somebody else. But in Counter-Strike, and FPS titles, because of the nature of aim, there's a little bit more RNG, in the sense that you have to consider how well you're playing that day, as well as how well your opponents are playing. And it's a bunch of players who are maxing out their ability to aim, and that's going to mean that you will lose duels where you shouldn't. And I think one of the big lessons in getting better at CSGO and CSGO analysis and becoming like a more mature player is understanding that you're never making 100% play, but you are trying to. So it's like you're constantly making a series of 60 to 80% plays, and you're doing that by, just as you said, making sure that you're taking advantage of good positioning at all times, decisiveness, and knowing when you have to trade for a teammate, meaning when you need to put yourself out of a comfortable position to make sure your teammate can stay alive, all for the sake of the round. And I think that is a kind of as an aside, I always found that we see that there's like immaturity with pro players in some regards, but I found that they are actually very mature when it comes to talking about living in that gray area of knowing what is right, but what can still happen.
Yeah.
And knowing that they made a 60% play and they still lost, but recognizing they still made the right one. I think that's a big thing.
Yes, it's a really interesting topic because I think, as you say, you can never make the 100% play. Again, bringing up poker previously, it sort of leads into the idea of expected value, which of course is a term that's thrown around in poker a lot, is plus EV minus EV, but it's not this to anyone listening that's sort of not familiar with it. It's economics. It's just everything. It's everything, life expected value, and it's all about risk analysis. And the interesting thing about it is that when we go back to the previous thing about outcome orientedness as a method of analysis, if you're thinking about plus EV or plus expected value and outcome orientedness, these two ideas conflict enormously, and this is where I think a huge amount of friction and frustration happens for players, because you get a spot where sort of as you're sort of talking about that some players are not very good at, is that you get into a spot where you aren't going to be encouraged to make the best play because you're thinking about an outcome, whereas the outcome doesn't exist. The outcome is just a percentage that could or could not happen. But what does exist is you making the correct strategic or a tactical play in that moment. And in that moment, it could be something where you might be very likely to die. Sometimes you're supposed to actually die. However, we have all these sort of pressures that suggest to us that is maybe a negative outcome for you as a player, for your career, for your rating, for this, that, or the other. Maybe people will perceive it poorly. But so it's like these ideas are very much divorced from each other. And yet one is a very good way to think about the game, and the other is a very bad way to think about the game. So it's really interesting to see sort of the pro players who sort of get that. And I do wonder how much it is in the forefront of their minds, or if it is just how many players do you think really go into that level of thinking, or is it just sort of we're left at the top scene? It's so competitive. We're left with the people that are just particularly game smart.
I'm not sure. I think that a lot of players are more mature than they let off, whether they get mad on a whim on stream when they make a play, or they feel like someone did something stupid. They might not really think that inside, and I think a lot of them have to have some level of maturity when it comes to stuff like that, to be able to stomach playing the game. Because if everybody was really just at the same level of maturity as your average matchmaker or somebody who's playing the game casually, then you're going to get so frustrated playing against good players all day long that I don't think that you'd be able to function really on a team where you've got to manage so many different people's emotions, and then also deal with your own, and then deal with losing. So I feel like a lot of pro players are a lot more mature than they might seem from the outside. And I think that the really good players can know when, just as you were saying, know how to take risks, and know when it's more important to think about their intuition, that I need to make this play right now, even though it requires me to do it with very little information, just because I feel like I need to. And I think that's one of the things that probably separates the good players from the great players, is being able to understand and then act on that in the moment.
And I think if we sort of go back from some of these elite level players who really get this, I think one of the more relatable parts of this discussion is sort of how, we as people who have spent a lot of time sort of, doing analysis and trying to figure out how to think about the game and what is efficient, what are good practices, and so on. It'd be interesting, I think, to get your take on, as I mentioned, models before, and using, positioning as one thing that would be a part of a model of how you would think about Counter-Strike. Because, again, for clarity, when you're playing a game of Counter-Strike or you have a demo, everything that happens is data. And so you have to give the data meaning. You have to create insight from that data. And to do that, you have to put the data through a model, like it's sort of like a filter in a sense. So, like, for example, we mentioned positioning. There are inherent ways to think about strength and weakness between weapons. We know the AWP is very good long range. It has an advantage over a Glock long range, for example. There are inherent advantages and disadvantages to some of the basic mechanics of the game. Are there any particular things that, or any, like if you were to think about it in this way, that, any sort of broad strokes that you would make, like positioning, inherent strengths and weaknesses behind, movement, weapons, and so on. Like, how do you think about models, do you have another way to think about it entirely? In fact,
yeah, I just try to keep it somewhat loose, just because I always, at least with the current state of statistics, and I think that's something we'll talk about in a bit, just how unreliable it is to look at a statistic and rate a player based on it. But the thing is about that is that there's a number out there for everything. So if you have the correct statistics, then you technically could accurately depict how much impact someone has based on their own criteria of it. But just as you're alluding to now, it's about defining the model so that can be understood. And I think if you were to divide the game up into what's most important and all the different areas and facets and the ways that you need to practice and develop as a player, I think you have something like aim, positioning, utility, communication, and I guess something like game sense might tie into positioning. But certainly positioning encapsulates a lot of things. There was a player, Ace from United, tweeted out, how do I be more consistent, or like what's the key to consistency? And the hard part about that question is, how can you guarantee you'll be consistent if everybody on the other team is playing at 100%? But then you have players like Nico, Coldzera, who can consistently dominate no matter what. And you would assume that because everybody has off days, that just means that they're way, way better on their worst day than almost anyone is. But I think the key is to not rely, or try not to rely on your aim at all times, because that is the number one way to breed inconsistency, is to consistently put yourself in a position where you have to hit a flick shot rather than line up a shot with crosshair placement. I think good players will be able to abuse that more. So certainly I think the most important thing of any of the criteria for what it takes to be a consistent or a good player, or how you should think about improvement, all comes back to your positioning.
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting, all of the factors that go into that, because as you say, everyone's sort of taking risks, and that's, as does what life is about, taking risks, taking the best risk possible. You can't avoid it. Playing safe is you're taking a risk by playing it safe as well, in many senses too. So it's really interesting because, if we think about like these models, like the meta game makes a really big difference, or even a meta between two teams makes a very big difference as to how you might decide to make certain decisions on positioning, on the kinds of strategies or tactics your team will run, and then based on the strategies and tactics your team will run, and the role that you have within the team, it puts you in certain spots where you are more or less likely to succeed. And I guess the common thread, and a very good example here, are players like Simple would be the best example for me, because Simple has. And this is, I think, the value of many players who are like him, and this is how people come up as well, is if you're super mechanically strong, you're able to mitigate a huge amount of the sort of unknowns and sort of the fluctuation of risk, and you can just sort of compensate with an incredible mechanical ability. But at the same time, it can't make up for everything as you alluded to. But I think it is it's definitely worth thinking about when we talk about this. As you say, you can't rely on your aim, and that is absolutely, I agree with that. It's the best way to think about it, because unless you are someone like Simple, and there is only one Simple, and there's very few people that have that degree of insane talent from a mechanical perspective. It has to come down to decision making. And also at the same time, I actually believe that some players can't achieve a certain level of consistency just due to the nature of the role and the way that their team functions too. And I think you're completely right. And this kind of topic is a great lead into that discussion around statistics, that it's very difficult, much more difficult than I think a lot of conventional sports, to really measure the performance of a player and the value of a player. I think is pretty hidden. I think we have a pretty, some pretty good basics, and perhaps, I would pose this question to you, like, what do you think about having like the rating? Because Petar from HLTV has done a lot of work on creating, he's a statistician, that's what he does, and he's created a lot of tools, and he's created rating 2.0 and so on, and it factors in a lot of things, and we see all these fancy statistics. But how much do you think of that is really, is it in any way reliable? Does it tell us something useful, or is it just sort of a distraction?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's value outside of it. Outside of actually trying to figure out this question of who is the best player, which might not be a question worth talking about in the first place, but I think there might be value for the game outside of trying to understand like who's a valuable player, in that it's kind of like it's entertainment. It's I think it makes the game more popular, I think, to be able to create these storylines around players like Simple, or just people who have ridiculous impact, even though we have incomplete information when it comes to figuring out how it is that they are offered up so much impact. Or is it really the fact that they're the best player in the world, or are they set up really well, or are they getting really lucky, or all these questions that we just don't have the answers to. We aren't inside the mind of Simple. We aren't even inside the team speak of Simple, So I think that the rating itself, it's almost certainly not perfect, but I think maybe the pursuit of trying to get that number 100% accurate is maybe pointless, and I might have to think about that a little bit more, but I think it might be, and it's also not. I'd say it's I don't know if we got that number. I mean, what would that mean? I mean, could we say that this guy could work on any team with players who all have the same rating? Does that mean that we can group IGLs, of being from a 1.10 to 1.10 to 1.20 is like, a superstar IGL, and they should be on a team with the star players at a 1.25 rating this year? And how do those numbers mean anything to a team or someone looking to pick somebody up? I don't know. I think mostly that number is useful for the sake of entertainment and creating storylines for people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that has to be some of the biggest value from the statistics that we're getting. I do think that there's some really cool statistics about utility and various other things. And I think that's the issue for me with rating 2, that does seem to be a bit too generalized. But stuff like, the effectiveness of a player and his utilization of flashbangs, stuff like this, I think as it's very specific, that is actually very useful. I think it's a very cool tool to have, insofar as having help from an analytical perspective. But speaking to that point, I mean, I have loads of amazing ideas, in my opinion, of analytical tools that would be really awesome that we don't have yet. Is there anything, what would be the one thing for you that you think would be super impactful and useful?
The number one thing would be being able to know what somebody says in certain situations. I just have no idea how that could be possible, to know how much communication I think is the biggest. Like, actually, when I earlier said that if you there's a number for everything, but I think the hardest thing would be to figure out, who made what calls and whose calls are really good, and how to factor that into a rating. So I feel like I would be a lot more comfortable talking about like the value of a player if we could understand what that player means to his team from his teammates' perspective. So that's the really difficult one for me.
I really want to see a tool that is actually an expected value type of tool. So, for example, we know map control is an important thing. Talking about models, that's definitely one thing that I think about. And information is map control. Map control is information. It's and also of course positioning, various other things. But we know it's very important. But what I would love to see, for example, is a tool that could pass maybe 100 demos in a professional Dust 2, let's say. You run it through, and then what you do is you separate the map into specific sort of areas. So long, and you sort of define that area somehow. It's okay. And so let's say someone does a long take at the beginning of the round. I would love to know the percentage upon what is like the expected value to like getting a bomb down on A from that point? Like how does that change the percentages of the outcome of the round potentially? Or how likely is it after doing that, if there's no kills, and how likely is it that then the team will get onto the bomb side? Or how likely is it that the T's will be able to convert that round or be able to convert the first kill and the first pick? And and then what are the strongest rotations for the T side after taking that bit of map control? Because of course, it's taking a portion of the map, much like on Mirage you would take mid. And that would be a very interesting statistic, or a very interesting way for me to look at the game, because it's very, very difficult to quantify those things. It's very difficult to understand the value of certain positions on the map. We know certain things are strong, but to me that would be really interesting, because I think it would change the meta game completely. Because there's a world of analytical tools that could really tell us a lot of stuff and make the selection of strategies much clearer. That would I think revolutionize the game a little bit. But maybe it's better not having it.
No, I totally see that. I think the data is out there, and understanding when Xyp9x plays mid to B on Dust 2, when he picks between whether he should be on the box to catch a mid to B hit or to be closer to game helper, see if you think someone's going to be on cat, like what influences his decisions, when does it work if he gets pulled a little bit in the other direction, and when it works that he's picking to be on the box, and like why he's doing that. I think that kind of data is just enormous. That's just how you download a player, right? For the other team to have that kind of information to know what smoke Xyp9x is going to move on, or like what for him constitutes a tell, and kind of understanding that better than he does, because you have parsed through thousands of demos where he's moved and not even realize what has caused him to feel that way, that he needs to move back or forward. Like that's a really big deal, I think. And we have Device uses, I think, heat maps, which is in the same vein of tools that would probably help to understand patterns that people have when picking or playing positions. But I think, as you're saying, it's kind of an archaic way to do it. There's probably like a much more accurate way to do it.
Yeah, and speaking sort of heat maps and sort of like analyzing the game in this way to try to create value, it'd be cool to touch on demos, because obviously that's sort of really at the core of what it is to be an analyst, is to look at a demo and gain insight, because you can pause. I don't know. It feels as though some people don't realize that. I feel like some people expect a bit too much sometimes from commentators when your job is not to, like, your analysis as a commentator is a very difficult skill to do, commentary and live analysis, and somehow fit that in. Real analysis comes from being able to pause the game and to see everything that's happening and have the most data as possible, as opposed to just picking the data that seems to be the most relevant, because you don't have the time to cover everything. And so if you're a player that wants to understand the theory of the game, then watching is frankly unavoidable. So, but the thing is that a lot of people don't find it fun. And I think that demo watching is very fun because the fun is tied into the value that you receive if you understand what you're looking for and what you're trying to get out of it and how to get there. And so how did that sort of process work for you? Did it take a long time for you to understand how to watch demos and get value from them? What kind of value can you get from them? Where is the fun for you? And where should someone start if they frankly look at it as a chore but they want to be a better player?
I've had a lot of people that have asked me how they should watch their demos and like what they're looking for when they watch a pro match. And I think there's a lot of things to consider. I think one of those things is that if you watch a pro team, and I think a lot of people think about this, is that are they doing something because they know something, or are they doing something because they're reacting to something? And if you don't know that, then it's hard to say, all right, this is a great decision, because they might have done it as an anti-strat right out of a spawn, or you might have missed something from a previous round. And I feel like when you watch a demo, it's a little bit more engaging and fun if you watch for a more narrowed down reason. So, for example, if you want to watch, you want to watch someone with great crosshair placement or something, just download a demo of Lekro, where he's just a fantastic deagle player, and just see like how he abuses his crouch peaks and his crosshair placement for an entire game. There's so much more going on in that game, but if you try to focus on everything, you'll probably come out with very little or nothing, and you won't remember it. And the other thing is that if you're trying to improve yourself as a player, I would also, only follow POVs, because then you get the full story on one player. Whereas if you're doing live analysis like we have to, you get a single perspective, and it's usually the only guy who gets a kill, and you're going to miss a lot of things. But what you're looking for really is when they make a play with X-ray on that we see, and they're doing something that you didn't realize they could get away with. And I think the example I always give is if you watch a recent demo of yourself, for example, say you're playing A-side on Mirage, and you're up on the balcony, and you've climbed up the ladder, and you're tucked into that corner, and you've been there before. And it's always a situation where you're the last person to rotate from A. You're not sure if the other team is going to hit A, they get a kill at mid or something. And you've got to decide, do I push through Palace or do I sit here and wait? And committing to pushing through Palace is such a big step. But knowing that if you don't move, they could go and take advantage of B, they're up a man, et cetera, is like something that you could only learn by watching a demo, because there's going to be a ton of situations where you could have pushed Palace, there was no one there, you would have won the round for your team. And I think that's how you unlock your like inner wall hack and be able to improve your ability to visualize, is by investigating those hunches when you thought you could make a play based on the incomplete information that we're constantly stressing. And I think that's how you take it to the next level.
It reminds me of that clip. I had a conversation with Sean Gez yesterday, and we recorded one, and I brought up the clip that was on Reddit where he was sort of tilted by the very opposite of what you were talking about there, where there was such a clear tunnel vision from a player. It's like, 30 seconds left. He could have thrown the smoke. He could close his eyes and thrown the smoke anywhere, and it would have been better than trying to use this really like strong one way in pit, which like helps no one except himself. And it's like not the right play. And it's just like a guy that's just not thinking about the macro element, like what is the time on the clock? What does that mean? Where are my players positioned? What does that mean? How far are the tees? What does that mean? How much utility do they have left in the round? What does that mean? And then really making the choice there. Instead, it's just like, how can I get the most kills? How can I get the best stats? And it really goes back to that sort of outcome orientedness, where that player is going to be like, well, even though we lost later, I can, say that I had all these frags, and that means that I can rest easy. I can sleep well tonight, knowing that I did my job. When in reality, it's a delusion. It's a rationalization in many respects, and it's very common. This sort of does bring me to one of the a topic which I think is pretty close to my heart in a sense, and it's this age-old argument about being an intelligent and analytical player that thinks about these things, that goes to the demos, that learns the theory, that slowly integrates that into his game, versus being very, very talented. And the question is really, how far do you think that someone can get? Do you think someone can get to the pro level with, not even a special level of talent, like just an average level of talent mechanically and for the fundamentals, but they have put a lot of time into analyzing and thinking the right way, and consistently keeping that approach up to really optimize their decision making? Do you think that in CS that can get you to the pro level, or like how far do you think that can take you?
That's actually something I wanted to ask you about, as I feel like as somebody who is like inherently analytical, I think one of the things that I've had to try to find a balance with is figuring out how to be analytical, but not too analytical to the point that I cause self-doubt, or I don't act quickly or quickly enough because I'm thinking. And I think that I've actually kind of gone in the reverse, and I've tried to study players who don't have the ability to explain themselves because
right.
Because they've just got that. They just know what's right and they do it. And I find it interesting to watch and learn from those players who are very talented and try to kind of backwards rationalize decisions that they make that they seemingly did off of like complete intuition, like 100% faith in themselves, and just there's something very honest about how good those plays are, as opposed to somebody who clearly synthesizes every piece of data to make like the optimal play. But is that something that, before I guess we talk about that, is that something that you've had to deal with as a Quake player in a game that moves very quickly? The idea of synthesizing every decision versus trusting yourself and kind of remembering your training to make decisions quickly?
The funny thing for me is that from my perspective, I was the biggest dumbass idiot, like mechanically sort of focused player that there was. I was like, that's who I was for a very long time. I was not a smart player. And I was very much in those years also somewhat of what I would classify now absolutely as a pseudo-intellectual. But I wasn't a good thinker. But I valued thinking very much, but I just wasn't a good thinker. I hadn't found the right approaches yet. And it wasn't until the later years when I really started to become even more obsessive about decision making, because my mechanics were like world class. I had really good mechanics. I had an incredibly good movement. Like my fundamentals from that perspective were really good, but my results were not really good. Or they were inconsistent. And I had some, great moments in that career, but generally speaking, I could have done a lot better. But it wasn't until I one day just decided to play Quake World in like 2010 or 2009, something like that. And obviously, like I suddenly realized this is a really cool opportunity here. I am really good at the movement immediately. I have amazing aim immediately. And it's a Quake game. Obviously, it's, there's people playing it. I've been playing it for 16, 18 years at this point. So they have an incredible amount of experience. So I thought to myself, this would be a really cool project. Surely I should just be able to be super good almost immediately. And I found out that was not the case. So very much far from it. So then I was thinking to myself, well, I know I'm like a world-class player, and that my expectation for myself in that sense was so huge. I was like, I can't leave this, playing this game experience not having achieved something like that. Like I can't leave being shit at a Quake game. That doesn't make sense to me. I've been playing this game for 10 years. That doesn't make sense to me. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to sort of make this a personal project, because it was so clear to me that the only thing that I had to figure out was how to make the right decisions. And so that was one of the biggest journeys for me from like a perspective of challenging myself analytically. I watched an enormous amount of demos. And this was also after I had also learned a lot about the psychological pitfalls from trying to play poker and learning a lot about poker and the psychology of poker. So I had that in my mind as well. And it was after I'd already been playing a lot of Brood War as well, and so on and so forth. So I was really geared up to be in a position to really tackle this. I put an enormous amount of time into it, and I got to a point where I could explain every single decision off of every spawn, off of every single moment, and I knew like the optimal play. And and I made some videos, I think, at the time where I was basically like pausing at the beginning of like every big decision I would have to make, and even some of the smaller ones, and I would explain exactly what the objective is here, and every single time, and exactly why, with all of the factors, because I had very strictly constructed these ideas based off of watching an enormous amount of demos, watching specific players, learning from specific people, and taking the approach you were talking about previously with demos too. Like, it's so valuable to, as you say, like, you almost want a bingo list. You almost want like a list of things where crosshair placement. I know this guy's good at crosshair placement. You go and watch that person. Then you go and focus on crosshair placement in your next game. And that is your outcome. Your outcome is, was I able to practice this skill set effectively? And it's all about, it became all about understanding not only the fundamentals of the sort of, let's say, like the common threads of like, what is like good positioning, like good team play, like, like how do you manage holding certain areas? How are you supposed to build your control? How are you supposed to convert, this into this gun into control over here, into a better position for your team over here, into setting up for this over there, and how does the movement pathing work? And like just all these little dynamics, and it's very similar to as you were describing CS, like you have to break things down in this way. And that's the way you get the most value. And you have to, it's like an athlete. I looked at it like, a sprinter, he doesn't become the best sprinter in the world just by sprinting. I mean, that's a very important part of it. That is incredibly important, but you also want to supplement the training. So the guy's going to be in the gym doing like specific, I actually don't know about the mechanics of sprinting specifically, but usually in most sports, like if you'll see football players in the gym, they'll be doing some squats here or there. They'll be trying to find ways to maximize performance in specific areas. It's just a very basic concept. So once I understood that from the analytical perspective and how that works from a decision-making perspective, and really exaggerating as many concepts as I could, I eventually got there. I eventually achieved what I set out to do, but it took me 1.5 years. But after that point, I'd done so much heavy lifting, like analytically, that I was just very analytically minded. And then I not too long it was maybe like 2 or 3 years until I started to tackle CS, and try to do it, like look at it in the same way. And that was so valuable. Honestly, poker, I think if I had to look at one thing that helped me the most analytically, it would probably be poker, because what I learned from poker was many things about the psychology, but it was mostly about understanding that as you mentioned, like you can never make the 100% play. It's all about finding what is the most consistent, what is like the most, what is always going to give you the highest sort of expected value, and that's like the first question. And once you can ask that question, then that leads you to the next thing, which will give you an insight on the next thing. And then all of a sudden you're putting the dots, you're drawing the lines between the dots in the right way, and you'll get there. But it was a really long journey for me, honestly. And I agree with you, going back to your original question, the dilemma is always between the performance aspect of the game, which is very much happening subconsciously, where you have like a huge amount of bandwidth, and your brain is able to pick up an enormous amount of patterns and react before you can even consciously like recognize what's going on. It's like your conscious mind has like a ping of 5,000 milliseconds, and your subconscious brain is like operating on LAN. It's like it's just
it's good. But
it's a really weird balance, and it's really interesting from a sports psychology perspective too, because the pressure of various situations is all conscious, and the conscious brain can bottleneck the subconscious and therefore the performance as well. As you say, if you get into this spot where you're analyzing things too much, so I think some of the best practices are to divorce your expectation of outcome, or your expectation in general, and just try to understand or set yourself up with, as an analyst, before you're in the game, of what is the best play now. And then at the end of the game, you can go and look at stuff and be like, did I make the best decision in that moment? I don't care about the outcome, because my performance, my mechanical ability is always going to be inconsistent. That is just the inherent nature of the game. First of all, I mean, unlike Quake, CSGO, it doesn't have even perfect first bullet accuracy. So there's things working against you here to really have you think that your aim is always going to be super good and consistent. You're going to lose a lot of fights, but you can always make the best decision given what you have in that moment. So that should be the aspiration. And so it's a really difficult journey. And we've seen so many professionals struggle with this. Like, if we look at Astralis, they had all of these issues from the choking perspective. And then it's just them, their psychology throttling their ability to perform. And that's what it all is. It's all in there somewhere. It's just you just have to find the right ways to stay in the moment, stay present, and so that in of itself is a huge discussion point. And I love all that shit. It's awesome. So it's to answer your question. For me, it's always an ongoing struggle. But I feel like I understand sort of all the parts that play to be able to still like put out good performances. But I'm also susceptible to pressure, very susceptible. Some people are much less susceptible, but I'm highly susceptible to it. So that's why I've had to like really think about this a lot.
Yeah, that's another thing. Is becoming a better player. You need to take those risks. Like you have to make plays because you don't know what's 100. If you make what you think is 100% correct, you'll just stagnate. Like there's no way that you'll ever learn how to become a better player. And there's just such a big difference between when you're sitting in a site, because that's the safe thing, that's what you know will work, and recognizing that this is probably a good time to swing on this guy who's probably holding W, which is a great time to peek someone. But if I wait 2 seconds and then do it, I might die because he's already around the corner. He's a little wider than I expected, and then I leave that game thinking, oh, I really regret being aggressive. But in actuality, what you needed to be was aggressive and decisive and peak right away. And I think that's one thing that I think that, a discussion like this might appeal to that kind of player. Somebody who is maybe just too conscious of what risks are and too afraid to act on impulse or just intuition. I think that it's really important, just again as an aside, to go off of those instincts and at least give yourself a platform, whether that is always matchmaking or a pug or even a scrim if you play a lot of matches, to indulge in that. And there was a conversation I had with Automatic where I noticed that in FPL and Rank S, I would see him play 1v1s really strange. And I asked him in an interview, I think it was my Dallas interview with him, did you do that on purpose? He's like, because he would just do, I think the first play I saw was just like, it was like be on cobblestone and he was at the rock and somebody planted on the site and he just like, threw a flash over and tried to sneak all the way back to the door and then went through drop. And it just seemed like something that you wouldn't try in a LAN situation. And I asked him if he made those plays just to try things. And he said, yeah, that's like the testing ground, and it's really important to allow yourself to do that so that you can develop. So taking risks is very important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's actually a dilemma that I think so many people go through. This idea that practice is like denotes your skill. And obviously Automatic in this position has somewhat of a secure position. He's like, okay, I'm in a pro team. My contract's not going to go and get terminated just because I have a bad performance in the pug. And so he gets sort of the liberty to try stuff. But there is a ways around that for everyone. It's really about understanding the most efficient methods and thinking about it in the right way, because trying stuff is so incredibly important. And I really love your point on talking about essentially talking about heuristics, like just trusting your instinct. This is something that, if you're very analytical, doesn't make sense in a way, because you can't really quantify that. It's very difficult. But there is something very scientific happening there, which is, again, your subconscious brain is incredibly good at picking up patterns and doing pattern recognition. This is called heuristics, essentially, like your brain being able to habituate certain behaviors based off of all the patterns that you witness. And if anyone's sort of wondering what I'm talking about here, if you've played enough of anything, could it even be a sport like football or something, as opposed to an esport, you'll recognize the moment when you did something and you didn't even know what the hell you just did. but it was 100% the right thing to do, and you feel like you were cheating. Like that, like every time someone has had a moment like that, that's your subconscious brain just knowing what to do based on a huge amount of data that it's absorbed, and sort of a value system that is, you know, being loosely applied, that it's like learned over time that this is good, this is bad. And so trusting your instinct, I think, as you say, is really important. And I think you touched upon an issue that a lot of people really struggle with, is that the difficulty of understanding whether a risk is good or not. Because if your risk goes badly, you have a team that like, guy, dude. So, I don't know why I say guy. I never said that before to describe someone in my life, but they were saying, like, why are you dying? Like at the start of the round. Like in reality, maybe you just trusted your instinct. And again, like maybe you had an 80% chance, like, you know, if we were to throw a number out there, maybe like like your gut was telling you this is a really good play right now. But as you say, like, and I think you're completely correct, you can never make 100% play. There is no such thing really as 100% play. I mean, maybe there's someone who's going to nitpick and find something, but generally speaking, there really isn't, and it's not really a concept to live by. So it can go wrong, and then you feel like, oh God, I fucked it up for my team, as opposed to maybe being a guy that sort of finds an identity, much like Stewie, where Stewie is incredibly intuitive in the way that he plays. You know, simple, incredibly intuitive in the way that he plays, and okay, they have the aim and so on to help back it up if it goes a bit wrong, which is how they become a bit more consistent and how they can really make that and cement it into an identity. But it is, as you say, like it's a nightmare for someone who's very analytical, because your sort of instinct is that this might be a good risk, but you sort of don't know necessarily why. So then you create this friction again between sort of the performance part of your brain, maybe if you want to call it that, the subconscious, and then the conscious brain, and that creates, as you were saying previously, the opposite of what you want, which is it creates indecision and it creates hesitation. And maybe you'll still make the play, maybe you won't, maybe the moment will pass, and it's all gone a bit wrong. So it's really difficult in that sense to really figure things out. And I think instinct really can't be like this is another reason why you have to be nice and trust your teammates sometimes, because then, you know, it's not always going to go well, and sometimes they may make the completely incorrect play, but it still works out, and you're gonna be like, nice one, bro. You know, so it's a really interesting topic.
That is. There's actually a couple of things there. I think there was I have a rule for that. Like when I think being an IGL, when you have to deal with the most people's emotions the most, when everyone comes to you to deal with everyone else's problems, that's what it makes you much more mature in handling that kind of stuff. And I think that a big thing that can help you get through it is understanding that people, generally speaking, are trying to make the play that they feel like will win the round. You know, most people do not want to get flamed by their team and go for frags just so that they can get a highlight clip for their YouTube channel. You know, I think that most people, when they make plays, they're thinking about, all right, I think, you know, either it's out of ignorance that they make a bad play, or they're doing something because they want to end the round early, which is I think a huge kind of justifiable reason that people will make an extra peek. You know, they re-peek something because they feel like this is a chance, the only chance that they'll have to get a kill. And maybe that's because they lack confidence, but it's not coming from a malicious place that they kind of make that decision. It was something that Socrates said it was Plato's Gorgias, where he said that I think he believed that the only time that someone would choose to do something wrong is out of ignorance. So actively choose. And I always try to remember that. And that is up for a debate, whether or not that, you know, what he said is 100% true. But I think generally speaking, you know, if you're playing on a team especially, you can always trust that people are trying to make in some weird rationale the best decision possible.
Yeah, I actually really agree with that. That's beautiful. It's eloquent. I like it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's really interesting, because that's everyone's worldview really has to operate upon the. This is kind of, I mean, the way that I think about it, but I do really think that everyone thinks that they're good and everyone thinks that they are making the right choice, because it is very inconsistent otherwise. But that's where things get really interesting, because what can happen as well is that people are also very good. I mean, when I say people, I mean myself included. We're all very good at sort of deceiving ourselves as well when it suits us. And I think that a lot of people will often also try to take the sort of path to least resistance in this sense as well, where it's very easy to not challenge the way that you think as well, and but to defend it. Like, it's easier to defend it and be defensive as opposed to being open and like looking to find out more answers about stuff as well. So this I think really plays into that social intelligence dynamic when it comes to being part of a team, being able to understand the best way to open somebody up to good and honest communication for a good faith-based discussion on their play or how things are going within the team, because defensiveness happens very quickly, and as soon as defensiveness can happen because someone feels challenged and in the wrong way, then it's only problematic, because whenever we have this crazy stigma about being wrong, generally speaking, and if not for that stigma, some people are sort of more vulnerable from a self-esteem perspective for themselves, that should they be in a position where they are challenged and called out to be wrong, that the defensive reaction occurs, and as a protective mechanism for their self-esteem, and then they will sort of rationalize their position, and they will sort of be a bit dug in that position. They'll have to hold it. So that is the sort of opposite way that you want to go. So that's the whole social intelligence aspect, I think, is also very fascinating when it comes to being in the team dynamic, which Counter-Strike is, and also being an analyst, because you do have to analyze your people. Like, you have to understand your people, not just the game.
That is interesting. There's a funny story about that. I think when I was at ESWC 2015 doing my first round of interviews, Simple was actually playing with Flipside, and Simple's somebody who, it's no secret that a lot of his former teammates have had some words to say about him. And it really does feel like the new #new Simple is coming in and is here to stay. It really is starting to feel like that. Yeah. So that's cool to see. But once upon a time, he was kind of a hothead, and I think that comes with being right too much. Like, if you make a series of bad plays, 10 bad plays, but you always bail yourself out because you're amazing, and now you're up 10-1 in a game, and your IGL, who's not so great, has made 10 pretty good plays, 60 to 80% plays, but has lost all of his duels and is 1-10, but then is now telling young player X that they should have done something differently on that round. They're going to get mad because they don't understand that they did something wrong, and because they could have done something better. And they're also being told by somebody who clearly seems like they're worse and know less about the game than them, because they're so wrapped up in the fact that they are getting away with their plays constantly. And that's a really difficult thing for young star talents to have to learn. Everybody has to go through that. It's also important that they're that confident, especially if you're an op or entry fragger. You've got to think about nothing but that you're the best, and I can skip this angle and I can get this skill, and et cetera. But that's a big learning process. And I remember at ESWC, it's a funny story. There's a round, Hiko was actually subbed in for the team. I think that was the first time Hiko played with Simple, and they played their match. And you mentioned earlier, 100% plays. And that is a question where there's almost no situation where there is a 100% play on Counter-Strike. But there might be a good argument for this one. Blade was in the last round of the game, so round 30, had planted the bomb the bomb was planted on A site on Inferno on default, and Zeus was at Arch. So from Zeus's position in this 1v1, there is no way that he can get to Blade by the time he sticks a defuse. And in the final seconds of the bomb clock, Blade gets on the bomb. Zeus runs out as he realizes he needs to, even though he wouldn't make it all the way to default. And Blade gets off the bomb to peek him, and the bomb blows up, and they lose the game. And then following this game, Simple deleted Blade on Steam at the LAN, and said he didn't want to play with Flipside, and tweeted that he can't believe that players who are this experienced can make decisions that bad. And that is a situation that's hard to justify. Like, how do you do something wrong there?
Yeah.
But that is interesting. It's actually interesting how IGLs, how they can they definitely do seem to understand how to use their teammates the best, but don't know how to do that for themselves, or maybe aren't really great with the pressure or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Because if you take Blade and you give him this scenario and you pause the demo and you ask him what the best decision is, he'll tell you what the best play is. But that's why it's so interesting, and also why I imagine very frustrating for simple in that context, as you described it, a young player haven't really had perhaps the time yet to really develop some of the thinking tools to understand that, especially again from his privileged position as someone that is impervious to pressure and is just a general god and can make anything work. So he's not in the best position to really sympathize, but pressure is a thing that affects players, and so that stuff just happens. Sometimes you give up the 100% situation, and then that happens all the time, and it's generally because, as you mentioned, there's so many other factors into making a decision. And, failure or human error is very much motivated by some of these sort of, these demons that sort of lives in your conscious brain, which you could, any manner of them or way that they can manifest, it essentially, becomes pressure in one form or another. Either it's your expectation for the match, or your expectation from your teammates, or your organization, or your fans, or yourself, or this, and then a whole host of other things that could potentially impact your performance. We've all experienced this example. Like, you're in a situation and you're having a really awful game. You're not getting very many frags. It's kind of clear that you're not having a good time. And sometimes, pressure for a player that is not very good at grounding themselves and sort of being in the moment, or has the right mechanisms, as we were describing before, where we're not thinking about outcomes. You're in a spot where every time you're in a position to make a frag, you have like added pressure on yourself. And if you're not amazing at dealing with pressure, or you have no sort of systems in your brain in place to help you ground yourself on the fly, which is definitely, there absolutely are coping mechanisms for people who are a bit more susceptible, then you're going to shit's going to go wrong. So it's just going to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's that's a really interesting element of the game. And again, I like how we sort of move towards some of the psychology aspects, because as far as being an analyst is concerned, I like how because I wanted to call this podcast quantifying the game. And I like how we talked about all of the things that are incredibly impossible to quantify. Yeah. Because, psychology, like these elements are very difficult to really figure out what's going on there. Then you've got, of course, we're looking at the statistics and we're like, well, we can't really tell much from that. And then we're sort of saying, okay, well, nothing is 100%. So I think what we've really learned from this is that it's definitely not very easy to be an analyst. And there are so many different sides to every single story. And when it comes to analyzing player performance, I think you really hit the nail on the head. And the only reliable way really is by looking at a demo and looking at it from like the micro perspective, because even then you don't know what's happening in the meta by the very definition of what the meta game is. You can't, it's the game outside the game, and there can be a meta game between two teams or between two players. And so there's a lot of information that you're just not going to have to really to get, to have the ability to make some of these analytical insights. So it's how do we bring this back to a place where we can excite people to be analytical and sort of give them a leg up in the sense that, okay, they want to learn more about the game and the theory. Like, what would you say would be good practices when it comes to, because we talked a little bit about sort of focusing on specific things, and I think that's amazing advice and one of the best ways to go. But are there any other sort of good practices that you would throw out there in the way that you would approach thinking about the game to be a better decision maker?
Yeah. I think there's some. I think because it's always important to remember, as we're kind of constantly stressing, that there's so much in the game that you cannot quantify, and there's no way to make 100% play. Almost every time. It's important to be humble in that regard, and also when it comes to your own progress, be kind of gentle with yourself when it comes to learning. But when it comes to the strategy aspects of Counter-Strike, I'm thoroughly against trying to control the footsteps of each of your teammates. I don't think anybody who has tried that has ever been successful. And to try to build your foundation of how to become a good player on things as simple as like map control. What makes a really good default, and what is the value of your default, and understanding that you could win almost any round on a default. I mean, if you really can believe that, I think then you can start to get somewhere. I think it's where I think people start to fall apart, or teams start to fall apart, when they rely too heavily on set strategies and don't have a proper understanding of what a default means and how powerful that can be, and how many places you can apply pressure, and how it opens up doors for you later in the round when things go wrong, and how it helps players who have good individual talent blossom because they can work alone or just with one other teammate. And I think that work from a team aspect, at least, working out from there, so map control and defaults is certainly the place you want to start, as opposed to why this set execute is so good, and how we can make the set execute somehow perfect so that it would work every time versus 3 players on a site. I think that's something that shouldn't be pursued.
It's really interesting, all the different ways you can really effectively sort of navigate sort of the environment of CS by thinking in some of these ways and looking at some of these things. Like Sean brought up rotations as, like, in his opinion, that's the most important thing. Like, his teammates, if they understand nothing else about the game, this is not in his words, but it's essentially like he emphasized the importance to this degree almost, that he really needs them to understand rotations. So would you say rotations has that level of importance too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like just a giant tell if somebody doesn't understand, like if you, like on cash, if you're going to set up in a 2-1-2, there's no good reason for 2 teammates to go through truck to A site. One person should always go out through mid, and should probably be the one to smoke for the guy at mid. And just having that person go out, even though it's going to be a 2-1-2, having that person go out through highway as opposed to go out through truck is such a big deal. And it's only because they showed up going that way, when time wise it would have been almost the exact same thing. So there's definitely a lot of value, and that comes back to positioning, right? Just being in the right place at the right time. And I think it comes back to the concept of, if you were to hold on to an angle, and I went over this in the swag crosshair placement video, it's like you could be somebody who had absolutely no mechanical ability whatsoever, but as long as you had a decent reaction time and your crosshair was in the right place, you could kill any player, like no matter how good they were. And being in the right place in the right time is like paramount to what you would define as a good rotation as well, right?
Absolutely. It's man, it's such an awesome topic, and I'm hesitating in sort of exploring it, because I feel like we've sort of come to the end of the time. But I mean, this is the great thing, right? Because we're talking about analysis, and I could ask you a lot of questions about it, but you have an awesome category, archive of content on your YouTube channel, and you're super accessible to ask questions when you stream, and you stream all the time when it comes to these topics. So plug yourself a bit as like for the end of the show here, because I feel like there's not enough people watching your content.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm trying to get to 100K subs. So youtube.com/CSBoxer. I have a bunch of new videos coming out. I've done like 6 casual cast / analysis videos on Sydney and Marseille that will be uploaded in the coming days. And we've got a video going up on at ECS, I think, this week. It's done. It's on Cirque. And I'm not sure when this is coming out. But yeah, that's what did you call the highlight video?
Can you tell us what you called the video?
I actually, no, I can't tell you.
Oh, okay. Because I know you had some funny working titles. I liked it. That's cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of good ones. And then I'm also doing merchandise. So there's no analysis there, but we have cool shirts. So store.boxer.tg.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I really feel like we can have a lot of follow-ups in a similar vein to this discussion, or about perhaps a lot of other things, anything involving esports competitively. Perhaps we could even branch out to other games. I know you're a big StarCraft and fighting games guy, but I'll refrain for now, and I'll just end by saying thank you very much for joining me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.